Hi guys, it's Jane from Megovanen, and today we're going to talk about the Death of Saruman. Saruman the White was one of the wizards of Middle-earth and a member of the White Council. He was once one of Gandalf's greatest allies, and that was before he reasoned that there was no hope fighting against Sauron, and as such, he turned on the people of Middle-earth and used his magic to create a new army to destroy Rohan at Helm's Deep. While Saruman was definitely a villain, he is an important character and also a memorable one. So in this video, I want to talk about the death of Saruman on Orthanc as portrayed in the extended edition of Jackson's trilogy because I have mixed feelings about this sequence. And while I have a lot of respect for the production team, they kind of dropped the ball on this one. Jackson's trilogy drastically alters Saruman's original book ending. In both Tolkien's original work and in the movie adaptation, Sauron is the main villain, but for a good chunk of the story, it is Saruman who is the Fellowship's immediate threat, even if he does not once show up on the battlefield, nor does he even have any one-on-one time with the main heroes or protagonists of the story, apart from Gandalf. Instead, for the entirety of the story, Saruman is in the Tower of Orthanc, erecting and commanding a large army of orcs and Uruk-hai. With The Lord of the Rings being the classic story of the victory of good over evil, Saruman was fighting on the side of evil and therefore did not survive the War of the Ring. Now, when we consider Tolkien's original account, Jackson's theatrical release, as well as the extended edition, we really have three versions of Saruman's death. In the original story, Saruman escapes the Tower of Orthanc by negotiating with the Ents. From there, he heads to the Shire and takes control of the region. When our four hobbits return home after the ring is destroyed, they find the Shire utterly under Saruman's dominion and are forced to expel him. We find this sequence in Chapter 8 of The Return of the King that's entitled The Scouring of the Shire. After losing the battle, Saruman is killed by his assistant Grima Wormtongue. The Scouring of the Shire was not included in the film version of The Lord of the Rings, and this was a good call because not only did we have more than enough endings to tie up the main story, but Jackson had just given us two giant battles. Aragorn was crowned king, the hobbits were recognized as heroes, and it would have been unfathomable to essentially bring us back to the battlefield for yet another conflict of good versus evil after spending the last 30 minutes wrapping up good's victory over evil, because had they kept it, it would have fatigued audiences who had already invested 3 hours to the main story. So it made sense to adapt the screenplay for this part of the story, and I'm 100% with Jackson on this one. A new ending was therefore required for Saruman. In the theatrical version of The Two Towers, the death of Saruman is hinted upon at best. We don't get a dead body or anything like that, but what we do get is a last glimpse of Saruman when he's stranded on top of Orthanc after the Ents had intervened and flooded Isengard at the end of The Two Towers. Then, at the start of The Return of the King, Aragorn, Theoden, and the company go to Orthanc to see what's up, and the Ent leader, Treebeard, says his power is no more. Honestly, this is a bit problematic because from the few lines of dialogue that we get, we're meant to understand that the threat of Saruman has subsided, that Saruman was defeated by the Ents. Jackson's trilogy is my all-time favorite film, and I love his adaptation to pieces, but I was not impressed with this sequence because a villain of such stature deserves a more fitting ending. I mean, for the last 6 hours, this guy has been causing havoc for our heroes, and we're just meant to assume that he died. It was not good. But at the same time, this patchy ending to Saruman's death was not the original game plan. In fact, this was plan B. Plan A was an on-screen death that was to be included at the end of The Two Towers after the Battle of Helm's Deep and the flooding of Isengard. Jackson filmed a scene in which Gandalf, Theoden, Aragorn and company confront Saruman at Orthanc. During this confrontation, Gandalf tried to get information from Saruman about Saruman's next move, but that didn't work. During that same confrontation, Saruman refuses to come down from the tower, which unexpectedly results in Wormtongue stabbing Saruman from behind and Saruman falling from Orthanc and landing on a spike. While I prefer the option of an on-screen death instead of the off-screen death that we get in the theatrical version, I'm not a big fan of this ending because it's way too gruesome. Also, I find that the entire conversation was really unrealistic because Orthanc is 500 feet tall. I know that this is a fantasy story, but one of the great things about Lord of the Rings, about the story, is that it's a fantastic story, but there's something about it that almost feels realistic. When I watch it, it feels like the events could have taken place years and years ago and could have been part of our ancient history. But when we have a scene where folks can communicate back and forth with one another, even if they're 500 feet apart, it kind of chips away at the credibility of the authenticity of Middle-earth. And I was not a fan of that. Now, while I was not a fan of this scene for those reasons, Jackson and his editing team removed it from the end of the Two Towers, but for entirely different reasons. The first reason was that although the intense confrontation and death of a major character lasts only 5 minutes on screen, the second film was already very long, and including the scene would seriously stretch the limits of how long a person can comfortably sit on a theater seat. The second reason had to do with the narrative flow. Jackson tells us in the appendices that while the scene was originally intended to end the Two Towers, it was ultimately removed in order to wrap up the second film faster. And the idea behind that was that the sequence could be edited at the start of the third film of The Return of the King. However, when it came time to edit the third film, they realized that inserting an opening that was more about mopping up the events of the previous movie would essentially hamper the narrative flow of the third film. So for this reason, the sequence was just cut completely, and we ended up with Plan B, which was no on-screen death for Saruman at all, and an assumption that Saruman was defeated by the Ents. Unfortunately for Jackson, Plan B did not go over well for both the fans and for Christopher Lee, who portrayed Saruman. Christopher Lee was so against Plan B that he reportedly boycotted the premiere of the third film as a result of his character being cut from the final film. This also drove a 10-year grudge between Lee and Jackson that was only healed when Jackson invited Lee to come back for a scene in The Hobbit. I don't remember why I read this, but I do remember reading that Lee accepted the role, and it was under the condition that the scene would not be cut under any circumstances, which makes sense. Now, I don't want to talk about the Hobbit adaptation because I'm not a fan, but I'm a big fan of Christopher Lee. Not only did he deliver a spectacular performance, but Lee was a huge fan of The Lord of the Rings and had been reading the novels at least once a year for many years. Lee he had actually met Tolkien once, so he was the only person involved in the production who had actually met the professor, which is super cool. Now, with Lee's disappointment as well as pressure from audiences who were left unimpressed with the vague ending of such a great character, there was a petition that was going around that circulated that requesting that Saruman's deleted death scene be restored, and Jackson eventually restored the scene in the extended version of The Return of the King, aka Plan C. I know I mentioned earlier that I'm not a big fan of this scene, and I'm not. And whether it's at the end of the second film or it starts the third film in the extended edition, I don't like it. It's too gruesome and it seems unrealistic. But what I am a fan of is the behind-the-scenes story about this scene. When filming the scene, Peter Jackson told Christopher Lee that he wanted him to, when he gets stabbed, to scream as a reaction of being stabbed in the back by Grima Wormtongue. Christopher Lee responded that, have you any idea what kind of noise happens when somebody's stabbed in the back? Because I do. And he knew that because before becoming one of the greatest actors of all time, Christopher Lee had served in World War II. Yes, in World War II, and he knew exactly what kind of sound to make. So instead of screaming, Christopher knew that the proper reaction was to gasp as he's stabbed by Grima Wormtongue. While I'm not a fan of the scene, The story behind the scene elevates the scene just enough for me to not lose, to lose zero respect for Jackson's trilogy, and the Lord of the Rings trilogy remains a perfect 10 in my books. Okay, that's it for today. I'd love to hear your thoughts about this scene. Did you love it? Did you hate it? Would you have been okay if this scene was included at the end of the Two Towers, as was the original plan? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you wish, like this video and subscribe to my channel. It really does help. Farewell.